She had always loved music, though she had never thought of herself as a performer. From a young age, the piano had been her closest friend. The soft weight of the keys beneath her fingers, the way the notes seemed to float through the room, and the gentle hum that lingered in the air after each chord. All of it felt like home. Most people in her town knew her as quiet and unassuming, someone who smiled politely but rarely drew attention. Few knew how much music meant to her, how she could spend hours alone in a small room, fingers dancing across the keys, losing herself in the sound. Her life had been ordinary in many ways. She worked in a local cafe, pouring coffee and serving pastries, chatting with customers just enough to be friendly. On the surface, it seemed like a simple life, calm and routine. But inside, music lived in her heart like a secret flame. She had learned pieces from old sheet music she found at the library, some classical, some modern, and she would practice them slowly, carefully, making them her own. She didn't need anyone to notice. Playing was enough. The way a note could linger in the air, making her feel something she couldn't describe in words. That was enough. It was on a quiet morning in late spring that everything changed. The cafe where she worked was hosting a small community event. Local residents came to share stories, sell handmade crafts, and listen to music. There was a stage in the corner, small and simple, with a few chairs and a microphone. She had no intention of performing, no desire to step into the spotlight. She was content to pour coffee, clear plates, and watch from the side, quietly enjoying the atmosphere. Then a familiar voice called her over. It was the organizer, someone who had seen her in the cafe many times. "Would you play a piece on the piano for the audience?" they asked, a hopeful smile on their face. She blinked, startled. I don't know," she said quietly. She had never performed in front of a crowd, not even a small one. Her hands trembled slightly at the thought. "Just a simple tune," the organizer said reassuringly. "Nothing complicated. Something everyone can enjoy." They handed her a sheet of music. She looked down and saw the notes. Plain, easy, familiar. It was not a challenging piece, not one of her favorite compositions, but it was something she could play. Her heart raced. She wanted to say no, to retreat into her safe little world. But then she noticed the anticipation in the eyes of the organizer, the hope in the small crowd that had begun to gather. She nodded. "Okay," she whispered. As she walked toward the piano, her mind raced. She had never been on a stage before. The keys looked different under the bright lights, and the room suddenly felt larger, the audience bigger than she had imagined. People were chatting, laughing softly, waiting for something to begin. Some were curious, some skeptical, and some had probably come for the food, not the music. She could feel their eyes on her, though she tried not to notice. Her fingers itched to touch the keys, but she took a deep breath and sat down, trying to calm the nervous energy in her chest. The piano was old but well kept, its wood shining softly under the light. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling the smooth surface, the subtle resistance beneath her fingers. The sheet music rested in front of her, simple notes that promised ease but offered no guarantee of magic. She took another breath and closed her eyes for a moment, letting her mind settle. This was not about impressing anyone, she reminded herself. This was about the music, about letting it flow through her. She began to play. The first notes were cautious, careful, following the sheet as written. They were soft and gentle, filling the room with a quiet melody that was simple but pleasing. Some people nodded politely, others continued their conversations, glancing occasionally at the young woman at the piano. She noticed it all but did not let it distract her. She played as if no one were watching, letting her hands guide her through the familiar patterns, letting the music come naturally. As she continued, she began to feel something shift inside her. The notes no longer felt mechanical or routine. They began to carry her emotions, small at first, then stronger with every chord. The joy she felt in music, the quiet melancholy she sometimes carried in her heart, the hope she held for the future. All of it began to emerge through the piano. She added subtle variations, little flourishes she hadn't practiced, moments where she lingered on a note just a fraction longer than the sheet suggested. It was not about perfection anymore. It was about feeling, about connecting. Slowly, she opened her eyes and noticed a change in the crowd. The chatter had quieted, replaced by a soft attentiveness. People were listening. Some had stopped what they were doing entirely, drawn in by the unexpected depth of the simple tune. She could see older listeners leaning forward, curious, as if they were hearing something familiar yet new. Children tilted their heads, ears wide, sensing something beautiful in the sound. She didn't know how they could feel it, but she felt it too. The music had transformed the moment. She let herself sink deeper into the melody, letting her emotions guide the keys. The notes danced, rose and fell, carrying a story she hadn't thought to tell aloud. It was a story of small triumphs and quiet resilience, of beauty found in ordinary moments, of hope that could shine even in simplicity. Each chord seemed to linger in the air, holding the room in a gentle embrace. She noticed a woman near the front blink rapidly, trying not to cry, and a man close by with a small, surprised smile, eyes glistening. The music was touching them in ways she hadn't expected. Time seemed to slow. She was aware of each note, each breath, each heartbeat. The simple piano tune had become a vessel for something larger, something deeper. She realized then that music was not about complexity or skill alone. It was about honesty, about sincerity, about letting the world see a piece of your heart. She could feel the audience's attention, their quiet awe, their emotions mingling with the sound. It was a shared experience, though she sat alone at the piano, and it felt magical. When she reached the final notes, she let them hang in the air, soft and lingering. The room held its breath. The spell was complete. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. She felt the weight of silence, heavy and profound, and she knew something had shifted, not just in the room, but in herself. She had stepped outside her comfort zone, faced her fears, and allowed her passion to speak. And the world, even for a few minutes, had listened. Then the applause came, slowly at first, then growing, swelling until it filled the room with warmth. People stood, clapped, cheered, some wiping away tears they hadn't realized were falling. She felt a rush of emotion, relief, joy, humility, all at once. She smiled softly, grateful and a little overwhelmed, and she realized that this was only the beginning. She had discovered something she had always known deep down. Music could touch hearts, even if it began as a simple tune. Afterwards, people came up to her, shaking her hand, praising her performance, telling her how moved they had been. Some admitted they hadn't expected much from a basic piece, yet she had turned it into something extraordinary. Children asked if she would play again, eyes shining with wonder. The older listeners smiled knowingly, sharing a quiet respect. And as she gathered her sheet music and stepped away from the piano, she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. That day, she returned to her small room, to her quiet life, but something had changed. The music no longer felt like a secret, something she hid away in solitude. It was alive, and she knew that if she allowed herself to share it, even a simple tune could move people in ways that words could never describe. She sat at her piano later that evening, replaying the melody, thinking of the faces in the crowd, the expressions of surprise and emotion. She realized that courage, even in small steps, could create moments of true beauty. And so, the young woman, who had once been content to play alone, began to imagine what could come next. The simple piano tune had opened a door she had never dared approach, a door that led to a world where music was not just a personal joy but a shared experience, capable of touching hearts and changing lives, one note at a time. After the applause faded, she felt a strange mixture of relief and nervous excitement. The kind of relief that comes from surviving something important, and the nervous excitement of realizing she had done something she never thought she could. People began to disperse slowly, returning to their conversations and activities, yet many lingered, casting glances toward her and the piano. Some were smiling, some still had that soft, thoughtful expression she recognized from her earlier gaze, the kind that came when someone had been unexpectedly moved. She didn't know what to do with all the attention. part of her wanted to retreat, to slip back into the quiet rhythm of her usual day. But another part of her felt an unfamiliar pull, a curiosity about what had just happened and what it meant. As she stepped away from the piano, her fingers still tingling from the final chord, a few people approached, asking questions and offering compliments. "That was beautiful," one woman said softly, eyes glistening. "I never expected a simple tune to feel like that." A man nodded, shaking his head in disbelief. "I felt something, I don't even know what, but it moved me." Their words were simple, yet they carried weight. She smiled politely, murmuring thanks, feeling slightly awkward but also deeply gratified. This was not about praise or recognition. It was about the connection. That was what mattered. Even as the crowd began to thin, she noticed that some people stayed near the piano, almost as if they were reluctant to leave the spell that the music had cast over the room. She had always known music could be powerful, but seeing it happen in real time, seeing people respond, opened a new perspective. She realized that music could be more than a private joy. It could be a shared experience, something that carried emotion from one heart to another without words. Later that afternoon, she sat outside the cafe, sipping on a cup of tea, trying to process everything. The sun had begun to lower in the sky, casting long shadows and turning the streets golden. She thought about how she had played the tune, the way she had added small variations, the little pauses and the soft emphasis on certain notes. It hadn't been in the sheet music. It had been instinct, emotion, the small improvisations that felt natural in the moment. She understood now that the beauty of the music had come not from the simplicity of the notes but from the honesty of her expression. She had allowed herself to feel, and in turn, others had felt with her. Her mind wandered back to the audience. She remembered the little boy who had leaned forward, wide-eyed, gripping the edge of his chair, as if he were holding on to every sound. She remembered the elderly man in the corner who had nodded slowly, a quiet smile on his lips, and the woman who had seemed on the verge of tears. Each of them had been affected, each had carried a piece of the music with them, and in that moment, she realized that music could bridge gaps between strangers, could reach people in ways that conversation could not. Despite the joy she felt, a small seed of doubt crept in. What if it had only been a lucky moment? What if the crowd had responded out of politeness rather than genuine feeling? She tried to shake the thought, reminding herself that she had played from the heart. And yet, the doubt lingered, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind. She wondered whether she could ever capture that same magic again, whether she could reach people with her music when she wasn't caught in the intensity of the first unexpected opportunity. Over the next few days, the experience stayed with her like a soft echo. She returned to her small apartment, to her familiar routine of practice, reflection, and quiet evenings. But she noticed a subtle change in the way she approached music. Each note she played now carried a little more intention, a little more awareness. She experimented with small adjustments, delicate changes in timing, slight variations in volume and emphasis, trying to recreate the connection she had felt in that crowded room. Her fingers moved with more confidence, more certainty, and yet there was also a lightness, a joy in exploring, in discovering new ways to make the music speak. One afternoon, a friend who often came by to visit noticed the change. "You've been playing differently," they said, curious. "It's like you're telling a story now, not just playing the notes." She smiled, hesitant but pleased. She hadn't realized how much her approach had shifted. She had always loved playing, but now she saw that it could be more than personal satisfaction. It could be a gift to others, a way to communicate emotions that words could never fully capture. Her mind kept returning to the audience at the cafe. She imagined the faces again, remembered the small moments, the surprise, the quiet reflection, the gentle awe. She thought about the simplicity of the tune, the way she had made it her own, and realized that perhaps it wasn't about playing complicated music. Perhaps it was about authenticity, about letting the music come from a place of truth. The simplicity had been the perfect canvas, and she had painted her feelings upon it. The experience began to inspire her in unexpected ways. She started to look for opportunities to share her music, not for recognition, not for applause, but for the chance to connect with others. She volunteered to play at small gatherings, community events, and even quiet moments in the local park. Each time, she felt a mixture of nerves and excitement, but she also felt the thrill of touching hearts, of seeing the impact of music in real time. People's reactions continued to surprise her. Some would smile quietly, some would close their eyes and sway slightly, and occasionally someone would shed a tear. Each response felt like a confirmation, a reminder that her music mattered. One evening, as she walked home after a long day of practice, she thought about how far she had come in just a few short days. She had gone from playing alone, uncertain of her abilities, to performing for others and discovering that her music could evoke real emotion. The world suddenly felt larger, filled with possibility. She realized that stepping out of her comfort zone, even in a small way, had opened doors she hadn't known existed. She also began to notice that her confidence was growing in ways that went beyond music. She spoke more freely, laughed more easily, and felt more present in her daily life. The piano had always been her refuge, her private world, but now it was also a bridge between her and others, a bridge between hearts and feelings. She thought about the people in the cafe, the little moments of connection, and she knew she wanted to continue sharing her music, exploring what it could do, discovering how it could reach people in ways she had never imagined. Despite the growing confidence, there were moments of doubt. Sometimes, before she performed, her hands would tremble, her heart would race, and she would wonder if she could ever recreate the magic of that first performance. But each time, she reminded herself that it wasn't about perfection. It was about sincerity. It was about letting the music flow naturally, letting it carry her emotions and reach the audience without forcing it. And each time she did that, each time she allowed herself to feel and express honestly, the results were always more powerful than she could have anticipated. Her friends and co-workers began to notice a change as well. People who had only known her as quiet and reserved now saw a spark, a new energy in her presence. They commented on the way she seemed more alive, more engaged with the world, and she realized that the confidence she gained through music was spilling over into other areas of her life. She felt more capable of taking small risks, of stepping forward when opportunity arose, and of trusting her instincts. Music had not only given her an outlet for expression, but it had also given her courage. As weeks turned into months, she continued to practice diligently, but she also began to explore ways to bring her music to more people. She played at local events, small gatherings, and even informal sessions in parks or community centers. Each time, she observed the reactions carefully, learning how subtle changes in tempo, emphasis, or phrasing could affect the audience. She discovered that music was a conversation without words, a language that could convey hope, joy, sorrow, or comfort, depending on how she chose to express it. Through these experiences, she also discovered a deeper understanding of herself. She realized that her initial fear of performing had been rooted not in her abilities, but in the vulnerability of sharing something personal. Music had always been her private world, and letting others in had felt risky. But each performance, each connection with an audience, reinforced that her vulnerability was not weakness, it was strength. It allowed her to reach others in a way that nothing else could. By now, the young woman had grown into a quiet confidence that radiated from her in small but noticeable ways. She walked taller, spoke more clearly, and approached challenges with a sense of calm determination. She knew that life would always have uncertainties, but she had discovered a tool, a gift, that allowed her to navigate them with grace. Music had become more than a passion. It had become a guide, a companion, and a source of strength. And though she continued to play simple tunes at times, she understood now that the beauty was never in the complexity of the notes, but in the heart and intention behind them. A basic melody could move mountains if played with sincerity. A simple song could touch souls if performed with courage. And she had learned that, in sharing her music, she was also sharing a piece of herself, a piece of her heart, with the world. A lesson she would carry forever. She arrived at the community hall that afternoon feeling a mix of anticipation and quiet determination. There was a small buzz in the air, a hint of excitement among those gathering for the next event. She had been asked to play again, this time for a slightly larger group, and while she was no stranger to performing now, a small nervous flutter still lingered in her stomach. It was familiar, the kind that came before something important, before sharing something of herself with strangers. She had learned to recognize it as a sign that she cared, a reminder that the music mattered. The piano sat waiting on the stage, polished wood catching the soft afternoon light that spilled through the tall windows. It looked ordinary, unassuming, but to her, it felt like a portal. Each key held possibility, each note carried emotion. She approached it carefully, her fingers brushing over the smooth surface before settling onto the keys. Today, she told herself, she would play with the same honesty and care that had moved people before. She wouldn't think about impressing anyone or meeting expectations. She would simply let the music speak. The audience began to settle in. Families, elderly residents, and a few young musicians who had come to observe filled the seats. There was a low hum of conversation, the sound of chairs shifting, the faint rustle of programs being adjusted. Some eyes flicked toward her with curiosity, others with mild skepticism. She could sense it all, but she didn't let it unsettle her. Instead, she let it guide her focus, reminding herself that every person in the room was here for a reason, and every one of them was about to hear something she cared deeply about. She glanced at the sheet music on the stand. Again, it was a simple tune, nothing complicated, just a series of familiar notes strung together in an easy pattern. But she remembered what she had learned from her first performance. Simplicity was a canvas. The notes themselves were the beginning, but the story came from her, from the choices she made, from the way she allowed herself to feel each chord. With a steadying breath, she began to play. The first notes were gentle, measured, filling the hall with a soft melody. She could feel the room settling into the rhythm, the low chatter fading as people focused on the sound. She noticed a few children leaning forward in their seats, eyes wide with curiosity. An older man, his hands folded in his lap, nodded slightly as if acknowledging something familiar yet profound. She smiled softly to herself, letting the music guide her beyond the sheet, beyond the notes. As she continued, she allowed her fingers to move freely, adding subtle touches that were not in the original music. A slight pause here, a lingering note there, a gentle rise and fall that mirrored the emotions she carried. The music began to transform, growing richer, more layered, even though the basic tune remained. She felt the room respond, an invisible thread connecting her to each listener. She could sense the attention, the curiosity, the quiet wonder building as the melody unfolded. A young woman in the front row pressed her hands together, holding back tears, and a man near the back leaned slightly forward, his expression unreadable at first but softening with each note. She didn't need to see every reaction. She could feel it, the way music traveled beyond the keys, beyond the room, touching hearts in subtle, profound ways. For her, it was both thrilling and humbling. Each note she played was a conversation, each pause a question, and each rise and fall a shared feeling. The melody deepened. She allowed herself to sink further into the music, feeling every chord, every interval, every nuance. It was no longer a basic tune. It had become a living story. She thought about her own experiences, the quiet struggles and small victories of everyday life, and let them flow through her fingers. She remembered the first time she had played for an audience, the nervous energy and the unexpected connection she had felt. That memory fueled her, giving her courage to explore the emotions hidden within the simplicity of the sheet music. She noticed subtle shifts in the audience. Conversations had stopped entirely. The hum of movement faded. Eyes were fixed on her, some wide with awe, others soft with reflection. It was the kind of attention that went beyond polite listening. People were not just hearing the music, they were experiencing it. She felt a profound sense of responsibility in that moment, aware that each note had the power to touch someone deeply, to stir feelings they may not have realized were there. She embraced that responsibility, letting it guide every choice, every movement of her fingers across the keys. A few minutes into the piece, she introduced small, intentional variations. She altered the tempo slightly, letting some notes breathe longer than written, adding a delicate lift to others. She experimented with the dynamics, letting certain chords swell while others softened to almost a whisper. Each change was subtle but deliberate, a way of communicating something more than the notes themselves could convey. She felt a thrill at the realization that even a basic tune could carry such depth when approached with sincerity. By now, the room had grown completely still. Children who had been fidgeting now sat perfectly still, mesmerized. Adults leaned forward slightly, holding their breath, listening with full attention. She felt the collective focus, the shared experience building around her. The music was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone in the room, weaving through their thoughts and emotions. It was astonishing, the way a simple piano melody could create such a profound connection, a reminder of the power of honesty and expression. She allowed the melody to evolve naturally, letting her emotions shape the flow of the music. There was a moment when her hands moved almost instinctively, carrying her through a gentle crescendo that filled the hall with warmth. She felt the energy in the room shift, a ripple of emotion passing from person to person. She noticed a few faces glistening with tears, some smiles quietly forming, others frozen in quiet contemplation. It was a mixture of emotions, raw and beautiful, and she let it inspire her further. As she neared the end of the tune, she felt a profound sense of clarity. Each note, each pause, each subtle flourish had brought her and the audience closer together. She realized that the magic was not in her skill alone but in the willingness to feel, to be present, to allow the music to carry her and the listeners into a shared emotional space. It was a lesson she had learned the hard way, through practice, reflection, and the courage to step into the unknown. The final notes lingered in the air, soft and resonant. She held them, letting them fade naturally, and for a moment, there was complete silence. The room seemed suspended in time, as if everyone was collectively absorbing the journey they had just experienced. She exhaled slowly, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment, a quiet pride that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with connection. She had taken a simple tune and made it resonate, not just with her own emotions but with the hearts of others. Then, the applause came. It started softly, almost hesitantly, and then grew, louder and more enthusiastic, until the room was filled with claps and cheers. She smiled, feeling the warmth of the response but remaining humble. It was not about the praise. It was about the shared moment, the mutual acknowledgement that something beautiful had been created together. People came forward to express their gratitude, some shaking her hand, others simply offering a smile, eyes bright with emotion. After the performance, she stepped away from the piano, heart still racing, but with a calm certainty that she had done something meaningful. She walked through the hall, listening to the echoes of her music mingling with the conversations now resuming, feeling the weight of what had just occurred. It was more than a performance. It was an experience, a quiet transformation, both for herself and for those who had listened. She realized that music had the power to bridge distances, to reach people in ways that words could not, and that even a simple tune could carry profound beauty when played with honesty and care. Later, as she packed up her sheet music and prepared to leave, she reflected on the journey so far. She thought about the nervousness she had felt at the beginning, the doubts that had crept in, and the courage it had taken to trust her instincts. She realized that every performance, every choice, every moment of vulnerability had brought her to a deeper understanding of herself and of the power of music. The basic tune had been a starting point, a canvas on which she had painted something far richer, something that transcended the notes themselves. She walked home slowly, the evening air cool against her skin, and felt a quiet joy. The day had been a reminder that fear and doubt were natural, but they were not insurmountable. They were part of the journey, part of the process of growth and discovery. She thought about the faces in the audience, the moments of stillness and emotion, and she felt gratitude, not just for the opportunity to perform, but for the chance to connect, to share, and to be seen in a way that mattered. As she entered her small apartment, she sat at her own piano, letting her fingers glide over the keys once more. She played slowly, thoughtfully, revisiting the simple tune that had begun her journey, but now with the depth and emotion she had discovered along the way. Each note felt alive, carrying memory, intention, and connection. She smiled softly, knowing that this was only the beginning, that there were more melodies to explore, more hearts to reach, and more stories to tell through music. She had learned that simplicity was not a limitation. A basic tune could be extraordinary if approached with sincerity, if allowed to carry the emotions that lay beneath the surface. Music was not about impressing others with skill or complexity. It was about truth, feeling, and the courage to share a part of oneself with the world. That truth had become clear to her now, and she knew that every performance, every note, every pause was an opportunity to touch someone in a way words could never achieve. The day of the next performance arrived with a quiet excitement that seemed to hang in the air. She had been invited to play at a larger event, one that was not just a community gathering but a small celebration that drew people from neighboring towns. The thought of a bigger audience stirred a mix of anticipation and nerves in her chest. She had grown more confident since her first experiences, but the feeling of stepping onto a stage, facing a crowd, never fully disappeared. It was part of the magic, part of the thrill, and part of the vulnerability that came with sharing something deeply personal. She arrived at the hall early, giving herself time to adjust to the space and to the piano that awaited her. It was an older instrument, a little worn, but perfectly capable of expressing the music she wanted to share. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, feeling the texture of the wood, the smoothness of the ivory beneath her touch. This piano, like her, had its own history, its own character. She had learned to respect it, to listen to it, and to let it respond to her intentions. Today, it would help her tell a story. The hall was filling quickly. Chairs were being set, people were moving about, some chatting quietly, others looking around curiously. The energy was different from smaller gatherings. There was an expectation here, a sense of occasion, and she could feel it pressing softly against her. She reminded herself to focus on the music, on the emotions she wanted to convey, rather than on the size of the crowd or the judgments that might exist in the minds of strangers. When it was finally time to begin, she walked to the piano and took a seat. She placed her hands gently on the keys, letting herself breathe and settle. The sheet music she had been given was simple, straightforward, a basic tune that could have been played by anyone. Yet she knew, as she had discovered before, that it was not the simplicity of the notes that mattered but the honesty of the way they were played. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting her mind quiet, and then began. The first notes were soft, tentative, floating through the hall like a gentle breeze. She let them set the tone, filling the space with warmth and calm. She noticed the audience beginning to still, their attention slowly gathering. Children stopped moving, adults leaned forward slightly, and the general murmur of conversation faded into silence. The music began to create a space of its own, a world where only the sound and the feeling existed. She felt the weight of their attention, but rather than being daunted, she welcomed it. As the melody continued, she began to add subtle variations, just as she had done before. She allowed herself to linger on certain notes, to emphasize the emotion behind each chord. She introduced gentle rises and falls, small pauses that made the music breathe. Her fingers moved instinctively, guided by the feelings she wanted to convey. She was no longer thinking about the audience, the sheet music, or the expectations. She was simply expressing, allowing the music to flow through her and into the room. The effect was immediate. She could feel the audience shifting with the music, their collective focus intensifying. There was a hush, a quiet reverence, as if the hall itself were holding its breath. Some faces were impassive at first, but gradually expressions began to change. Eyes widened, mouths parted slightly, and a few people pressed their hands to their chests as if the music were reaching inside them. She could see the subtle signs of emotion, the way the music moved them, and it gave her courage to play even more fully, more honestly. As the tune progressed, the simple melody began to take on new life. Each note carried weight, each chord spoke with clarity. She thought about the moments in life that were both ordinary and profound. The small victories, the quiet struggles, the fleeting joys, and the hidden sorrows. She let these thoughts guide her fingers, shaping the music in ways that were unplanned but deeply felt. It was as if the piano had become an extension of her heart, translating the unspoken emotions into sound that everyone could feel. By the middle of the performance, she could see the impact more clearly. A few people had tears in their eyes, some were biting their lips to hold back sobs, and others sat motionless, completely absorbed in the music. She realized that the simple tune she had been given had become something extraordinary, something that resonated far beyond its notes. It was a transformation that came not from technical skill but from authenticity, from courage, from the willingness to be vulnerable and open. She allowed herself to become fully immersed in the music, letting the emotions guide every gesture. The hall seemed to respond, the air itself vibrating with the resonance of the piano. She noticed subtle reactions, a hand pressed against a cheek, a quiet inhale, a child leaning against a parent for comfort. Each small movement told her that the music was reaching them, connecting with them in a way that words could not. She felt a deep sense of humility, realizing that she was part of something larger than herself, a shared experience that could touch lives and create memories. The tune began to build gently, not in volume or force but in emotional depth. She allowed the crescendos to rise and fall naturally, guiding the audience through the peaks and valleys of feeling. There was a moment when the hall was completely silent except for the piano, a moment that felt suspended in time. She could sense the collective breath of the listeners, the shared attention, the way the music had woven them together. She had become a conduit, a vessel through which emotion flowed from one heart to another, uniting strangers in a quiet, profound connection. As she approached the final section, her hands moved with a deliberate grace, each note carefully considered, yet flowing effortlessly. She felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration, the kind that comes from pouring oneself completely into an expression. The music had carried her, and she had allowed it to guide her fully. She was aware of the tension, the anticipation, the expectation, and yet she played without fear, without hesitation, trusting the music and herself. The last notes were delicate, almost fragile, held just long enough for their weight to sink into the room. She allowed them to fade naturally, listening as the silence embraced the hall. For a moment, there was no sound except for the faint rustle of the audience as they adjusted in their seats. She opened her eyes and felt the intensity of the moment, the raw emotion that had filled the room. It was more than applause, more than recognition. It was a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that something meaningful had happened. Then, slowly, the applause began. At first tentative, then building in strength and warmth, filling the hall with sound. She could see people standing, some with tears on their cheeks, others smiling softly, overwhelmed by the beauty they had just experienced. The reactions were varied but united by one thing: a genuine, heartfelt response to the music. She allowed herself to feel the impact without letting it distract from the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she had played honestly, fully, and sincerely. Afterward, people approached her with quiet reverence. Some spoke softly, describing how the music had moved them, how it had reminded them of memories long forgotten, of emotions they had kept hidden. Others simply offered a nod, a smile, or a handshake, a way of expressing gratitude without words. She listened, responding with humility, realizing that the music had created something beyond her expectations. It was not about skill, complexity, or perfection. It was about connection, authenticity, and the courage to share a piece of oneself. Later, when she was alone, she reflected on the experience. She thought about the audience, the expressions, the moments of quiet emotion, and the way the music had transformed a simple tune into something unforgettable. She understood that her growth as a musician was inseparable from her willingness to be vulnerable, to express without reservation, and to trust that the audience would receive her honestly. That trust had created the magic, and it was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. As she packed her sheet music and prepared to leave, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that music was not just about performing for others. It was about listening, feeling, and sharing in a mutual experience. The simple piano tune, once unassuming, had become a vessel for profound emotion, teaching her that even the most basic melodies could move hearts if played with sincerity. She smiled softly, thinking about the people who had experienced it with her, and felt gratitude for the opportunity to touch lives through her music. Walking home that evening, she thought about the journey so far. She had faced nerves, doubt, and uncertainty, yet she had discovered a deeper understanding of her own abilities and the power of music. She felt more confident, not in a boastful way, but in a quiet assurance that her music could connect, comfort, and inspire. Each performance was a reminder that courage, authenticity, and emotion mattered more than technical perfection. She returned to her small apartment and sat at her piano once more. Her fingers moved over the keys, replaying the melody from the performance, exploring it in new ways, testing subtle variations, and listening to the emotional resonance it created. She realized that her growth was ongoing, that each note, each pause, and each expression was part of a continuous journey. Music was not static. It was alive, evolving with every performance and every shared moment. And as she played that night, she felt a quiet certainty settle over her. The simple tune that had once seemed ordinary was now transformed into something extraordinary, a reminder that even small gestures, when made with sincerity and heart, could leave lasting impressions. She understood now that vulnerability, courage, and honesty were the true keys to touching others, and that each performance was an opportunity to create a meaningful connection that could resonate far beyond the notes themselves. The day of the final performance arrived, and she felt a strange mixture of excitement and calm. By now, she had performed several times for different audiences, each experience teaching her something new about music, about herself, and about the quiet power of connecting with people through sound. Yet, even with all that experience, a familiar nervous flutter lingered in her chest. She reminded herself that this was normal. It was part of the process, part of the beauty of stepping onto a stage and sharing a piece of her heart. The hall was larger than any she had played in before. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm patterns on the polished floor. Chairs were arranged neatly, and people were beginning to file in, filling the room with quiet chatter and soft laughter. Some faces were familiar from previous performances, others new, drawn by the invitation to hear her play. She felt the subtle hum of anticipation in the air, a mixture of curiosity and expectation that wrapped around her like a gentle tide. The day of the final performance arrived, and she felt a strange mixture of excitement and calm. By now, she had performed several times for different audiences, each experience teaching her something new about music, about herself, and about the quiet power of connecting with people through sound. Yet, even with all that experience, a familiar nervous flutter lingered in her chest. She reminded herself that this was normal. It was part of the process, part of the beauty of stepping onto a stage and sharing a piece of her heart. The hall was larger than any she had played in before. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm patterns on the polished floor. Chairs were arranged neatly, and people were beginning to file in, filling the room with quiet chatter and soft laughter. Some faces were familiar from previous performances, others new, drawn by the invitation to hear her play. She felt the subtle hum of anticipation in the air, a mixture of curiosity and expectation that wrapped around her like a gentle tide. She approached the piano slowly, her hands brushing over the smooth wood as she sat down. The instrument felt alive beneath her fingers, each key a note waiting to speak. She glanced at the sheet music one last time. It was the same simple tune she had played before, a basic melody that many might have considered ordinary or forgettable. But she knew better now. The tune was a canvas, and she was the painter, free to fill it with color, texture, and emotion. As she began, the first notes were soft, tentative, floating through the hall like whispers. The audience began to settle, their attention slowly gathering. She noticed the children leaning forward, their eyes wide with anticipation. She saw adults holding their breath, leaning in slightly, some with a quiet smile forming at the edges of their lips. Even before the melody grew, She could feel the connection forming, the invisible threads of attention and emotion linking her to each listener. The music began to flow naturally, gaining confidence with each note. She added subtle flourishes and delicate pauses, letting the tune breathe and rise and fall with the emotions she carried inside. She played as she had in past performances, but now with a deeper understanding of the impact her music could have. She allowed herself to feel every note, to let it speak not just to the audience but through her, expressing moments she had not fully articulated before. The hall seemed to respond, holding the music gently in its walls. The audience was quiet, absorbed, and she could sense the subtle shifts in their expressions. A few people were holding back tears, while others were simply still, listening with rapt attention. She realized that music could reach people in ways that words could not. It could bridge distance, convey emotion, and create a shared experience that left an imprint on the heart. This understanding gave her courage, and she allowed the melody to carry her further, deeper into expression. She began to introduce variations she had not used before. Small rises and falls, tiny stretches of notes, moments of silence that made the music linger. Each decision was guided by emotion, not technique. She let her intuition lead her, trusting that the honesty of her performance would resonate with the audience. The simple tune was no longer just a melody. It had become a story, one that spoke of hope, vulnerability, resilience, and quiet joy. As she continued, she noticed the subtle effects on those around her. Children leaned closer to parents, some softly pressing their hands to their hearts. Adults closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, allowing memories and feelings to surface. She saw a few people biting their lips to hold back tears, and a couple of elderly listeners wiped away quiet streams of emotion. Each reaction was a reminder of the power of music, of how even the simplest notes could carry the weight of human experience. Her own emotions deepened as she played. She thought of all the moments that had led her here, the hours of practice alone, the early performances, the doubt and nervousness she had felt, and the courage it had taken to share herself with strangers. Each memory added a layer of depth to the music, making it richer, fuller, and more meaningful. She realized that the magic was not in the notes themselves but in the way she allowed herself to be vulnerable, to feel, and to express those feelings honestly. By the middle of the tune, the room was completely absorbed. The soft hum of anticipation had disappeared entirely. It was as if the music had created a separate world, one where only sound and emotion existed. She felt the unity in the room, the shared connection, and it filled her with a profound sense of fulfillment. She understood that this was why she played, why she practiced, why she had faced her fears. This was the reason music existed, to reach people, to touch hearts, and to create moments that linger long after the final note has faded. She allowed the melody to rise and fall, to swell gently and recede, carrying her emotions and those of the audience together. The simple tune was now alive, full of texture and nuance, each note speaking more than the sum of its parts. She played with intention, listening with her heart as much as her ears, letting each moment unfold naturally. The music flowed seamlessly, a reflection of her inner world and the quiet beauty of human emotion. As the final section approached, she slowed slightly, allowing the last phrases to resonate fully. Her fingers danced gently over the keys, careful to let each note linger and breathe. The audience was motionless, fully present, completely immersed in the music. She felt a deep connection with every person in the hall, a shared understanding that transcended words. In that moment, there was no separation between performer and listener. There was only music, emotion, and presence. The final notes hung in the air, soft and fragile, and she allowed them to fade naturally. For a moment, the hall was completely silent, everyone absorbing what had just happened. She took a breath, her heart racing with a mixture of exhaustion, exhilaration, and quiet satisfaction. She had done what she had come to do. Not just play a tune, but share a piece of herself, touch the hearts of others, and create an unforgettable experience. Then the applause erupted, slowly at first, and then growing, louder and more enthusiastic, until the entire hall was filled with sound. People stood, clapped, and some wept openly, overwhelmed by the beauty of what they had just experienced. She smiled softly, humbled by the reaction, yet grounded in the understanding that the music had done its work. She had been a conduit, not the source, and the magic had existed in the shared emotion between performer and audience. After the performance, people approached her, some with tears in their eyes, others with quiet smiles. They shared how moved they had been, how the simple tune had unexpectedly touched them, how the honesty in her playing had made them feel deeply. She listened, responding with gratitude, feeling both humbled and enriched. She realized that the impact of her music was not about technical skill or complexity, but about courage, vulnerability, and the willingness to share oneself openly. Later, as she walked home, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the first tentative notes in the cafe to this moment, she had grown in ways she hadn't imagined. She had discovered that music was more than a passion. It was a language, a bridge, and a source of connection. She had learned that even the simplest melody could carry profound meaning if approached with honesty and emotion. And she understood that her own willingness to feel, to be present, and to trust herself had created the experiences that others would carry with them long after the performance ended. Back in her apartment, she sat at her piano once more, fingers resting lightly on the keys. She replayed the melody from the performance, exploring it with newfound understanding. Each note felt alive, imbued with emotion, and resonated with the memories of the audience's reactions. She smiled softly, realizing that this simple tune, once considered ordinary, had transformed her, had taught her about courage, connection, and the quiet power of sincerity. As she played that night, she understood something profound. Music was never truly just about sound. It was about heart, about intention, about allowing oneself to be vulnerable and open. It was about creating spaces where people could feel, reflect, and connect in ways that words alone could never achieve. She had discovered the beauty of simplicity, the power of emotion, and the transformative nature of shared experience. She also reflected on the courage it had taken to step onto the stage each time, the moments of doubt she had overcome, and the vulnerability she had embraced. Each performance had been a step forward, a journey not just in music but in life itself. She understood that the path was ongoing, that there would always be new opportunities, new audiences, and new emotions to explore. But she felt ready, confident that she had found her voice and her way to reach others. In the quiet hours that followed, she continued to play, improvising slightly, letting her fingers wander across the keys in a dance of emotion and reflection. The music was a companion, a guide, and a reminder of what had been achieved. She felt gratitude for the experiences, for the audiences, and for the simple piano tune that had sparked this journey. It had begun as something ordinary, but through courage, sincerity, and heart, it had become extraordinary. She realized that the lesson extended beyond music. Life itself was full of simple moments, ordinary opportunities, and basic choices that could become extraordinary if approached with honesty and intention. She understood now that vulnerability, courage, and authenticity were universal tools, whether in music or in life. She had learned to trust herself, to trust the process, and to embrace the power of sharing a piece of oneself with the world. The next day, she woke with a quiet sense of purpose. She knew there would be more performances, more moments of connection, and more opportunities to touch lives through her music. She felt ready to continue, not for recognition or praise, but for the joy of expression and the shared experience that music offered. She had discovered that even a basic piano tune could move hearts, create memories, and transform ordinary moments into something unforgettable. And so, she continued to play, each note a reflection of her journey, each melody a bridge to others, each performance an opportunity to connect, inspire, and evoke emotion. The simple tune had taught her the beauty of vulnerability, the strength of sincerity, and the quiet power of music to touch the human heart. She understood that this was only the beginning, and that the journey of discovery, expression, and connection would continue, note by note, moment by moment, for the rest of her life.